back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan.
Yellow.
Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Melgen.
Hello.
Welcome to you.
Thank you.
So, interesting story.
Yeah.
Last Sunday at Mass, we had a bit of a scene outside.
Right before
Mass began. There was I would call him a protester.
Yeah. Individual.
An individual protester who was approaching people who were coming into Mass.
Yeah.
And were verbally sort of sharing their displeasure with the Pope.
Yes.
Saying the Pope is the Antichrist.
Oh, yeah, it was the anti-pope.
Anti-Pope.
John Paul II was the Antichrist.
Okay, John Paul, oh, sorry.
I got corrected twice on that. Yeah.
Okay. So the Pope is the anti-Pope. John Paul II was the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Oh, what a horrible thing.
And he was handing out a bunch of materials.
Yeah, like
to
a
prove
DVD,
it. Yes.
In case anyone has a DVD player still, saying what Vatican II, how it was not legitimate.
Yeah.
Then there was quite an impressively large handout.
Yeah, it was a lot of writing.
It was a lot of writing
a lot of small writing on a big page.
But quite a big page. That I don't know where they would have printed those from.
Holding the record for the most words printed on a pamphlet.
Yeah. Anyways, of course, talking about us more of the same. How Pope Francis was a heretic, right? I think that was actually the title of that.
I believe so. Why the Pope Francis is not is
cannot be the Pope. Yeah. Anyways, all this to say is that
this is a belief that is out there, and it has a specific name.
Yeah, and it's called Sedevacantism. Which means sedevacante. We heard that term a couple weeks ago because the seat is empty. Remember? So when there's no pope, the seat is empty. And Matthew, of course, reminded us before we went on the air that we were all Sedevacantists for
a few weeks ago.
A few weeks ago for about 15 days between the death of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo XIV. So today we're going to talk about why people believe in Sedevacantism, because not only is it just people who have the bizarre courage, I would say, to come to Mass and interrupt as people are preparing to enter into the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, but also there's sort of, I would say, a growing trend. People really who are steeped into researching online and looking at all the angles and theories of stuff, kind of find themselves, their curiosity piqued by Sedevacantism. So today we're going to break it down, what it means, why people believe it, and why it's not true. Right? Yeah. Because people will argue against it. So remember, it's the... and let's just make it clear. Yeah. These aren't like most Sedevacantists find themselves or believe themselves to be Catholic.
Yeah.
They believe
the true Catholics.
And more so. Yeah. They believe themselves to represent the true Catholic faith, and that the church after either the election of Pope John the 23rd or after the Second Vatican Council, or interestingly, after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, is a counterfeit church, is not the real church, is posing as the Catholic Church, and again represents the Antichrist, or all of the popes hereafter were anti-popes.
Yeah, so like you said, there's three different. I think one of the ties that kind of come, because we're seeing this more and more now, and we've even done podcasts on it, that our church is going. A lot of people coming into the church are turning towards the Latin Mass and turning towards more traditional forms of ritual and celebration and stuff. And what happens is in this Sedevacantism type atmosphere, it ties very closely with this. It's not the same, but it ties very closely because Sedevacantists are very orthodox in their celebration of things, and so they prefer the older traditions. They don't like Vatican II, so they prefer the Latin style Mass and all that kind of stuff. And so they people that are enjoying the Latin rite there's a lot of overlap there between these two. So if you're looking up online, you're going to see very similar chat styles, or you're going to agree with a lot of things that maybe Sedevacantism say that kind of start to pull you towards that mentality. But we're going to show you why, some of the things is right. Now, the very first thing I can just bring up is if one of the biggest problems that I have with it, and it kind of comes right off the top, is that if whatever Pope, let's use Pope Pius XII, though, is the last true Pope.
Is what they believe.
Is what they believe. Yeah, that's what they believe. If that's their discussion, it means that every bishop that has been ordained a bishop from Pope John the 23rd on, when any one of those popes have ordained a bishop or a cardinal, or then those bishops have ordained priests, it means then that there is no legitimate authority left in the Catholic Church, because none of the priests, we don't have very many priests now that are ordained by a bishop that was
when Pope Pius
right?
XII, because his papacy ended in 1958.
So you would have to have been a bishop at that time to then ordain a priest at that time. You know what I mean? It just kind of goes on. So we don't have a lot of those, if any, but there'd be very few. And so that means that all the sacraments that we're receiving right now in the Catholic Church are illicit and aren't falling in line with the true Catholic Church. Well, here's the problem that I have with that, is that we know very well that Jesus said in Matthew that it doesn't matter, the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. He's established his church here on earth, and the gates of hell will not establish against it. And so that would be kind of taking that completely out of context. If we haven't had the proper vicar of Christ here on earth for the last, how many, 75 years almost now, then that's a problem. That's showing that the gates of hell have prevailed against the Catholic Church. And so that's just right there debunked, in my own opinion. Okay, no. And so there's got to be something else. And as we kind of suggested before, so Sedevacantism, taking away the authority of the church or the Pope and the church and stuff, is a form of Protestantism. Protestant. They're a form of Protestantism that because they don't believe in the true authority of the church as God has seen fit. And we believe, so. Yeah.
I just want to rewind a little bit, because people might be confused about why Pope Pius XII, like me, I'm learning about Sedevacantism as well. But so the idea goes, and Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Pope Pius XII was the final legitimate pope, because after his death, Pope John the 23rd was elected pope, who began the Second Vatican Council,
That's right.
which is the council that Sedevacantists reject.
Yes, that's right.
And the belief that if a pope commits heresy, then they are no longer the legitimate pope. So they connect Vatican II with committing heresy, which means John the 23rd can't be the legitimate pope, which means anyone elected after him also cannot be elected the proper pope. So that's why Pius XII, in their eyes, is the last legitimate pope of the Catholic Church. Just to give some clarity there.
And from that point, the chair of St. Peter has been vacant. That remains vacant.
Hence, sede sit vacante, vacant.
And they can't even agree on that, because as Matt was suggesting, it could be not only then, but it could be John the 23rd, who could be the last legitimate pope. And then some people believe it wasn't even that. It could be going all the way that everything else is fine, Vatican II. But you know what? Pope Benedict wasn't allowed to resign. And so because Pope Benedict wasn't allowed to resign, Pope Francis, once he died, there was no election for a new pope, because he resigned, and then Pope Francis. And so they don't think that Pope Francis was legitimate, because Pope Benedict was still alive. So until Pope Benedict died, there should have been another election, and then there should be a pope, and that was the only way that the chair of Peter could have been passed on. And so they can't decide on who's the last pope. But for the sake of argument, who we're talking about, normally it's pre-Vatican II, and so I think that's where we'll keep our discussion.
And like the point is that they believe that currently the chair of St. Peter is vacant, and so whether or not they think it's because Pope Benedict's resignation of the papal office was incomplete or invalid. That's probably the least common form. I think the most common form is that Pope Pius XII was the last, validly pope, validly established pope. But there are different reasons for why people are Sedevacantists, and like you kind of break them into categories. So you have kind of theological Sedevacantists. So the person we encountered before Mass was of this type. So just like the idea that like if a pope is either a material heretic, acts out heresy in their private life or their personal life, or says something on an airplane that contradicts the deposit of faith, in their opinion, that they are just de facto resigning the office and then the chair is vacant. You have you would say kind of cultural Sedevacantists that is really just rooted in a rejection of the Second Vatican Council, and you would say kind of this form is the one that's more appealing to people who are leaning in that more kind of traditional that Vatican II is where things went wrong kind of approach, and I would say that that's kind of the most common, that it's rooted in a rejection of the Second Vatican Council, and they kind of reverse engineer the cause for why the seat is vacant. You also have you'd say kind of a conspiratorial angle, so people who are looking at, they would say kind of irregularities around the election of Pope John the 23rd, and they'll say no, they that when they had the conclave, and the smoke indicated it started out as white, and then it turned black. And the underlying conspiracy is that a pope was elected. In this case, they name him as I believe Cardinal Siri was elected, but then something changed. Another decision was made on the inside, and there are all kinds of conspiracies tied to this. That it's Freemasons, or the communist forces within the Vatican said, no, we're going to install our own guy, and by their own admission, their guy is who ended up becoming John the 23rd, and as we'll find out, none of these really hold water. None of these kind of really either obtain historically or kind of theologically. So we can maybe address the last one quickly because again there's not a lot. Yeah, it's fairly quick and easy. Sedevacantists will say never before in the history of a papal conclave has white smoke shown up and then it turned to black. And in kind of doing some research around this, it's actually happened quite a lot. And there's been a lot of confusion. Just
whether it was white or whether it was black.
A lot of time, and historically, you just kind of wait it out and see like, okay, is it actually white? Because in our previous episode, we talked about like the chemicals that they use to, and like how they actually show white smoke is much more refined now than it was 70 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago. That the way that they used to make black smoke is that they would add kind of tar pitch to the smoke, but like that would take a little bit of time. You're burning paper, you add something else, you would have kind of fluctuations. So much so that around 2005, they actually changed to the specific chemical that they add, as well as ringing the bell at St. Peter's to indicate, how they use papum. That removes all ambiguity. So again, there and historically there was this irregularity at the beginning of John the 23rd's election, but again, it wasn't uncommon in the history of the church, and because the conclave is sealed, we actually don't know the details of what happened. But the conspiracy theory goes that John the 23rd was installed by either communist or Masonic factions within the Holy See. If that was the strategy, or if that is what happened, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't really work with kind of the preceding decades that you have the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which is very much in the line of Vatican II and John the 23rd, that definitively states that Freemasonry and Catholicism are incompatible. So just like if the Masons are installing their own guy to like put forward their, that didn't work out.
We talked about this on one of the episodes. So that's like
and one of the main kind of targets of Sedevacantism is Pope John Paul II. if communist forces were installed in the Vatican, if you look at the life of JP2, JP2 was one of the driving forces of removing communism from Poland. So again, there are a lot of ways in which this doesn't work, and as well as the fact that there's no way to actually confirm these details. Another maybe quick detail is that the alleged cardinal that was elected has stated that this isn't the case, stated his support for the Second Vatican Council, and has, throughout his ecclesiastical tenure, affirmed the papacy of John the 23rd and John Paul II.
Because they threatened him, probably.
Oh, yeah. but these are the types of arguments that are
that's the conspiracy side
that are made. Yeah. So again, that doesn't really hold water.
May I, for a second here, play devil's advocate and enter into listening to you? I'm gonna walk into the mindset of someone who follows or believes the Sedevacantism, because what I might appreciate about them is the desire for them to uphold tradition of the church and sort of this refusal of modernism, right? Yeah. And I would say that where this really started to maybe gain traction, especially in today's world, was over the papacy of Pope Francis. Yeah. It gave them fuel to say, look at some of the things that Francis is saying. Yeah. Hence the large paper we had delivered at Mass, so there's reason there to say, okay, there's something not right here. We got to stick to the traditions of the church. Okay, so something that might be something they're looking for certainty and stability, right? There's an attachment to the traditional Latin Mass there because, of course, it's prior to Vatican II, correct? Yeah. And this refusal of modernism entering into the church, right? Vatican II was supposed to sort of blow open the doors of the church to let the church out into the world, right? And they see it sort of as letting the world into the church a little too much, right? And then there's this sort of crisis of authority. You see some of the things over the past couple decades, right? Like the sexual abuse scandals, all this sort of, excommunicating certain bishops and whatever, maybe the financial scandal. So, you have people who will say, this is all a result because we're not living in the true church. Yeah. Right. It's what did you say? It's putting on
a counterfeit
church. So I could see how people would follow that. Not to discredit them.
Can I respond to that?
And yes. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I think people who are traditionally minded, who have seen some of the, and admittedly, misapplication of the Second Vatican Council.
Thank you.
That has maybe edged out some of our better traditional sensibilities. And we said at the end of the last episode that it's actually heartening that our new pontiff actually seems to have the capacity to reconcile traditional Catholicism with kind of a missionary approach that is representative of the Second Vatican Council. You would say, and Josh, you said that Sedevacantism is, properly speaking, a form of Protestantism. Yeah. This looks a lot like Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. This looks a lot like the 95 Theses. This looks a lot like identifying real problems within the church, and whether it's kind of an excessive or maybe misrepresented or misapplied theology of indulgences. A misapplication of the papal authority, raising real issues that were addressed 15 years later inside the church, but being manifest as a rejection of the church itself as the visible and unified representation of the body of Christ on earth. So again, you have maybe Martin Luther raising some real issues, but breaking off and doing his own thing, a wholesale rejection of the church itself. Whereas, 15 years later, you actually have in the Council of Trent a resolution to a lot of those things, or maybe
the actual issues, the main issues,
the legitimate issues that some Protestants had with the institution of the church at the time. People have some real and legitimate grievances against, I would say, the application of Vatican II, even if that's not a repudiation of the Second Vatican Council per se, and the reaction to it is a wholesale rejection of the magisterial authority of the church. And I would say that this is committing the same mistake. This is participating in the same Protestant attitude. So you're absolutely right. Some people do have these legitimate disenfranchisements, and I would say that the proper response is to address those within the church rather than depart and do your own thing.
And I would say to those two, like when you're looking at Vatican II, and we've talked about this in a Vatican II episode where we talked about what exactly Vatican II was. We talked about Latin Mass. We talked about a bunch of this stuff. So if you want to go in and see what we've said about those, go to other episodes that we've talked about this, because we've talked about this a lot. But one of the things that we always kind of come back to, though, is like 50 years in the life of the church is like a blink of an eye, right? It's 2,000 years old or more. But we're experiencing 50 years ago or more was Vatican II. And we are now just starting to come level. Like it's, I heard somebody talking about Vatican II. It's like any kind of council is dropping a rock in the water, and you're getting a big splash at the beginning, and then eventually the ripples kind of ripple out, and then now you've got the change as they start. And you kind of have these waves that kind of come through. That's what we're at. Like when people came back, and we've talked about problems that people had with Vatican II, was that people came back with their own ideas, and because of the way that the church worked at the time, you would have the bishops come back and propose their own specific ideas of how the church should have changed, not what the Vatican II documents said did actually change. And so we experienced it here in Canada just as well as anywhere else, where we had some major problems talking about practices and beliefs or ways of believing or ways of celebrating the Mass even, or that aren't in line with what the Vatican II changes suggested or said. And part of that again is we're not in the 50s, 60s. There's not a time that we have nowadays with the internet where as soon as the Pope is elected, we see his speech right for our own eyes. We can actually read his speech online. We can dissect his words at his first mass that he just did. We can do all that and put it all in line with what the church says. If we had that same technology in Vatican II, I'm going to suggest that more people that have read through it are not going to find the same problems with it, because they're going to look at it and go like, oh, that makes sense. Because anybody who's actually studied the actual documents of Vatican II, not what people say the Vatican II documents are, but actually studied and read through the Vatican II documents. And I'm going to suggest anybody who's looking at Sedevacantism as a real thing or a real option for them, go through and read the actual documents of the changes of what the church says. And you're going to find that there's actually, like, the changes are there for a reason, and there's good explanation to it. And then you have to also remember that all of the cardinals in the church agreed to this Vatican II change. And so we're saying that not just a pope, but it was all the cardinals in the church that are agreeing to this Vatican II change. It's not just a little thing. This is like all the head leaders. This is not one person just tossing off an idea as it might have been represented in a diocese back at home. But this is actually, so it's taken 50 years for us to kind of come back down and to actually understand what Vatican II is, realizing that we have kind of turned ourselves from an inward focusing church, that we're supposed to be focusing outward on evangelization and how that should actually look, right? And so that's what we're at now. And so Vatican II is that part. That's what I think that's what we have to understand and look at and realize. And so then if they can't accept that, then they start going into, well, it's the popes that are heretical. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's because again, a lot of the starting point for these, or the people who are maybe find this attractive, is a disenfranchisement with the application of the Second Vatican Council, and then you kind of reverse engineer either the conspiratorial kind of justification or the theological justification. So, and maybe just kind of to address that, like if you encounter these people that's like, okay, and the most common expression of it over the past 10 or 15 years has been directed towards Pope Francis. You know, Pope Francis said this in a homily. Pope Francis, said this on an airplane. He wrote this in an encyclical. This footnote is seemingly contradicting the deposit of faith, or there's a problem, and that the logic there is that this would, therefore Pope Francis is a heretic. So again, maybe the reason that doesn't hold water is that it employs bad theology, but more so kind of bad ecclesiology. Heresy has a very specific canonical definition. So just like heresy is the obstinate persistence in a false belief even after being corrected. Okay, so I can be a heretic if I say that the Catholic Church doesn't believe in the Trinity. Okay, that's the opposite of what we believe, and my spiritual director, my bishop, and anyone who's in a position of spiritual authority over me can correct me.
Yeah,
and you say and if I continue to say, if I'm standing outside of Mass saying these things, if I'm saying these things publicly, I can receive censure. If I persist in this false belief and publicly state it, I can be excommunicated. I can be subject to canonical penalties because I'm persisting in this heresy. That's what heresy looks like. To accuse the Pope of heresy, no individual within the Church has the authority or has the capacity or the charisms to determine that the Pope is a heretic. The only way that this can be done is in retrospect. So if a subsequent Pope, determines definitively that something that a previous Pope taught was false, that can be corrected, but there's no opportunity for that deceased Pope to persist in that belief. So again, you can't even imagine a situation where that applies.
Yeah.
So the only person who would be qualified to do that would do so from a timeline that doesn't allow for the persistence in that belief. So again, it's impossible technically for the Pope to teach heresy. And again, we even say like the fact that we have that promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against the Church. So again, it's difficult, and you have people in comment sections like the Pope is a heretic, like they don't really know what they're talking about, and there's more to say there.
And I think that you were talking about misapplication too.
Yeah.
Like, let's say the Pope says something heretical or the Pope says something wrong, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that he stops being the Pope.
Yeah.
No.
Saying something wrong or making a mistake or doing, even let's say someone behind closed doors, he yells at someone or does whatever. Yeah. It doesn't mean you've done that. You are no longer the Pope.
And there's a difference, and this is something that I think we have to bring forward. There's a difference between the sin of heresy and the crime of heresy. And so crime is that ecclesiastical line that we're talking about where someone comes down, gives you authority and says, no, you're doing it wrong, you persist in it, and you teach and everything else. But the sin of heresy would be thinking something or believing something that's not quite in line. But that doesn't come to play here, meaning you can wrestle and struggle with beliefs within your Catholic faith. In fact, we're supposed to. That's like the Israelites are called the people that wrestle with God, right? That was their name, was Israel, wrestle with God. And so God wants us to wrestle with our faith. And so wrestling, understanding or try or maybe not believing this thing at this time is different than actually going out preaching on it and saying it. Now, what they start to look at, I think, from the Sedevacantists that I've encountered and that I've looked up and researched on, is they start to take pieces of what Pope Francis said and said, look, he is teaching this in the form of magisterium as his seat of St. Peter, and therefore he is trying to make it doctrine or doctoral, and because of that, he's a heretic. But I think, as we've talked about Pope Francis many times, and this is where Pope Francis comes in because he spoke off the cuff a lot, is he said some things that were taken out of context and media just took it and ran with it. Sometimes he said things that weren't quite in line with what the Church specifically teaches on a subject. And again, we were used to Pope JP2 and Pope Benedict, who were very specific with their words. But Pope Francis, when you go back to what he's saying, you got to take Pope Francis as a whole, right? And what does he actually mean by this, or what does he say by this, or what? And if you're taking those things into account, he's never preaching from the seat of St. Peter heresy over and over and over again. You know what I mean? He is speaking to a very specific group of people that says, look, the worst thing in the world is this. And people are like, no, there's a lot more worse things than that. And you're forgetting this, that, and the other thing. Well, yeah, but what he was speaking to was the people that were there at the time. And maybe maybe specifically the social issues that were dealing with the people at the time. When he's talking about, like, you got to love, because this is one of the ones that come up on that piece of paper, that homosexuality and loving what the church actually teaches on homosexuality. Can you believe that Pope Francis said that we can't judge homosexuality? Like, that was one of those things that came, like, no, what he was saying when you read his words, he's like, in his diocese, what was happening where people were being kicked out, were being ostracized, and were being, like, physically beaten up and based off of their actions. And the Pope was saying, we are called to love everyone and not to their sin isn't a cause. Like, let God figure out the sin part. Don't be the judge, jury, and executioner on your own here. And so that was the way Pope. Now, his wording might not have been exactly doctrinal, right? But his idea, what he was talking about behind, said, no, you're supposed to love these people.
And we have to remember that there are certain criteria for the Pope to speak in an infallible way. That's right. Like, the Pope himself is not infallible.
No, not everything.
There are certain criteria that he has to, follow.
And I think you were right to say that, like, the Pope can make a mistake, and the Pope can even say something that is theologically wrong if it's not taught definitively. And in the past, there have been lots of examples of people we hold up as theologically airtight or erudite, who have made mistakes, who have said things that are not only, like, theologically problematic, but, like, outright false. So in our previous episode, we talked about Pope Leo XIII declaring St. Thomas Aquinas a doctor of the church. There was a small period of time where some of St. Thomas Aquinas' teachings were heretical, were rejected. And a specific example is that when you say that God could not create other universes or other worlds because of Thomas Aquinas' commitment to Aristotelian cosmology. So the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, and you have kind of a sphere that outside of that, it would be against God's nature to create multiple worlds that way. He was censured. He was corrected to say that, like, theologically you can't place limitations on God's creative power. Yeah. So it was like so that teaching was condemned. That teaching was considered heretical. St. Thomas Aquinas was not at any time considered a heretic because that teaching was rooted in a deficient understanding of science. So again, he's not teaching, and again, he's not persisting in an untrue belief after he's been corrected. So again, doctors of the church can make mistakes, can even offer theological teaching that can subsequently be proved to be false or shown to be false. Popes can speak errors. But the promise that we're given, and we hold up kind of the magisterial authority of the church, is that it can't teach heresy as definitive teaching or teach it kind of as established doctrine.
And we've got to remember that, some of these things that the Sedevacantists believe, you can still believe some of those things and still be part of the Catholic Church. You can still have an appreciation for tradition. Yeah. You can still, disagree with some of the writings of Vatican II. Yeah. But the Pope is the sign of unity in our church. Mm-hmm. He's the one at the head of our church. He's the one that brings us together. So, as Sedevacantists, that's one of the major problems. Yes. That they don't have unity there. I also want to mention that for people who there are options within the Catholic Church for people who like the traditional side more, like the fraternity of priestly fraternity of St. Peter is a fraternity of traditional Latin Mass. They celebrate the Latin Mass. They celebrate things with tradition. Also, tell me a little bit quickly, because we're running out of time, but the SSPX, the Society of St. Pius X.
Okay, so
they're right on the line,
and it falls in line with what you're saying, that there is another avenue. There's another response to, like, if you have a difficulty with the application of
Yes.
the Second Vatican Council, if you prefer kind of older, more traditional expressions of the liturgy. That, you know, the Society of St. Pius X is an organization, is a fraternity that have tried to reconcile these two things together. And they've had a kind of fraught past
rollercoaster,
in their relationship to the church, but also in relation to these other organizations that kind of reject Vatican II wholesale. So. And again, without going into kind of a detailed history, they are right on the line. So they are, that there is an open rejection to a lot of the teaching since the Second Vatican Council, but there is a desire to be recognized within the broader Catholic Church. So in many cases, they have been censored, they have been corrected. Even though a lot of their priests, their ordinations are valid, their faculties are not valid. So any sacraments that they would attempt to do would be illicit. They would not be considered valid within the church. And to persist in doing so would be
excommunicate.
Would be a grave sin. But in an attempt to kind of reconcile, again, different popes have extended kind of olive branches to restore some of their faculties. You know, they're able to do confessions. They're able to do baptism, or but again they're not able to consecrate the Eucharist, or they're not able. And again, the relationship has shifted over time. But again, you see this kind of desire to maybe correct what they see as a theological error, but also to operate within the broader kind of unity of the church.
I have so many more questions about Sedevacantism, and I think we could probably continue a conversation on another time about this. But I think it's important to highlight some of these things because ultimately the church wants to bring us together, and
Unity,
and the Pope is a visible sign of that unity. So it's unfortunate that the Sedevacantists don't see the Pope as a visible sign of unity. Perhaps, though, Leo XIV, maybe this might be on his agenda to sort of work on unity here, because it is possible. It is very possible to bring together the SSPX, the FSSP, all these other, so it is very possible. Maybe that's something that we'll see in the future. And I think that I would say that there's nothing wrong with appreciating tradition. But I think that once we get into the line of conspiracy or doubting that the church is is the
calling
real
the Pope a
church,
heretic,
or calling the Pope a heretic, I think we have to just draw back our conversation a little bit, maybe with a spiritual director, or in prayer, or with friends who might have a different outlook than us. When we surround ourselves with people with that sort of outlook all the time, I don't know if that's helping our belief system. But like I said, I have so many more questions that I have the fortune of asking Matt after we go off the air. But if you have questions about Sedevacantism, you can send us an email at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com, or drop a comment on our social media channels as well. That's all the time we have today. We are not Sedevacantists. We have a Pope, Leo XIV. And for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milgen, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.